Chapter 1. A Name Lost in War. The battlefield was a graveyard of steel and ash. The sky above was a swirling mass of thick smoke and fire, the remnants of orbital bombardments still flickering across the atmosphere like dying embers. The land below was no better. Twisted metal, shattered armor, and broken bodies littered the ruins of what had once been a thriving colony. A place that had once been full of life was now a ruin, a monument to war. Commander Darius Kane moved through the wreckage like a ghost, his heavy boots crunching over debris, his rifle held at the ready. His armor, once a symbol of order and command, was now scorched and battered beyond recognition. His HUD flickered erratically, glitching in and out of focus. Warning: neural sync failure. Memory core damage detected. Darius blinked against the flashes of red warning signs across his visor. They meant something. Something important. But he couldn't focus on them. He could only focus on the mission. Eliminate the enemy. The enemy. That was all that mattered now. Everything else, who he was, where he had come from, what he had lost, was irrelevant. The ghost of a forgotten life. Somewhere in the broken ruins, a voice called out. Darius stilled, his body reacting before his mind had time to process. His targeting system flickered to life, locking onto movement ahead. A figure emerged from the smoke. Their armor was scratched, their steps hesitant but determined. A survivor. An enemy. Darius's grip on his rifle tightened. His mission was clear. No survivors. He raised his weapon. The targeting reticle aligned perfectly on the figure's chest. And then, they spoke. A single word. A name. Father. Darius's entire body froze. Something in his mind fractured, a deep crack running through the wall of his thoughts. The voice was familiar. The word father felt foreign and familiar all at once, like a dream he had once lived but could no longer remember. His hands trembled against the rifle. The figure stepped forward, and through the swirling smoke, he saw her clearly. She was young, battle-worn, her armor bearing the same insignia as his own. Her golden eyes, sharp, piercing, were full of something he couldn't understand. Recognition, pain, desperation. She wasn't raising her weapon. She was reaching for him. His HUD screamed at him, enemy target locked. His training demanded action. But for the first time since the battle had begun, he hesitated. A soldier without a past. Darius's breath came fast and unsteady. His neural implants, damaged and malfunctioning, sent conflicting orders through his body. Kill the enemy. But this wasn't an enemy. Somewhere, deep inside, he knew her. But how? A pulse of pain shot through his skull, forcing him to one knee. His visor glitched violently, fragments of static flashing across his display. And in the static, a face. Not an enemy. Not a soldier. A child. A little girl with golden eyes, looking up at him with trust. A name, hers? Drifted at the edge of his consciousness, but he couldn't grasp it. The war had taken that from him, but it hadn't taken her. She was still there, standing before him, waiting. Father, please, she whispered. And in that moment, Darius Kane realized he had forgotten the most important part of himself. The end of the beginning. But war didn't wait for memories to return. An explosion shook the ground, sending shockwaves through the crumbling city. The girl flinched but didn't move from her place. She didn't run. She didn't raise her weapon. She trusted him. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Darius Kane lowered his rifle. The battle was far from over. But for the first time, he wasn't sure who he was fighting for anymore. Chapter 2. Fragments of a Forgotten Life. The ground beneath them trembled as another explosion shook the ruins of the battlefield. Darius Kane did not move. His mind was breaking. He had fought in countless battles. He had stood at the front lines, had seen comrades fall beside him, had pressed forward even as his body screamed in pain. But now, in this single moment, with this girl standing before him, calling him something he did not understand, father, his hands trembled. His rifle was still held loosely in his grip, the targeting system flickering between identifying her as enemy and unknown. Unknown. He didn't know her. Did he? The logical part of his mind, the part that had been trained to obey orders without hesitation, demanded that he pull the trigger, complete the mission, eliminate all opposition. But the other part, the part that had been silent for so long, buried beneath the weight of war, whispered something else. That he knew her. That he had once sworn to protect her. that the golden eyes staring up at him now had once looked up at him with love, not fear. Pain surged through his head again, a splitting sensation that sent him staggering back. He clutched at his helmet, trying to steady his breathing. His neural implants damaged, broken, malfunctioning flashed red warning signs in his HUD. Memory core failure. System reboot attempt failed. More static, more images. A child's laughter, a soft voice calling his name, small hands wrapping around his fingers. It didn't make sense. Darius had no past. He had been a soldier his whole life. There was no family, no child waiting for him. And yet this girl stood before him, whispering the impossible truth. Father. Her voice was soft, but the way she said the word shook him to his core. His hands clenched into fists. His breath was ragged. His mind screamed at him to ignore her, to move forward, to continue the battle. But his body refused to obey. Echoes of the past. The sounds of battle were growing distant now. Somewhere in the ruins, the remnants of both armies were still fighting. But here, in this moment, there was only the two of them. The girl, this enemy, this stranger who knew his name, stood her ground. She had not raised her weapon. She wasn't afraid of him, and that made no sense. Darius took a step forward. The girl stiffened, but still, she did not back away. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice hoarse, rough from disuse and anything other than barking orders. She hesitated. Then, carefully, she spoke. "My name is Rhea." Rhea. The name sent another shockwave through his mind. A memory flickered into existence. A younger version of her, barely more than a child, running through a field of silver grass, her laughter light as the wind, his hands lifting her into the air, her voice crying out in excitement. Then static. The memory was gone as quickly as it had come. Darius staggered back, gasping. This was impossible. He had no daughter. He had no past. He was a soldier. Nothing more. Rhea watched him carefully. She knew what was happening to him. "They took your memories," she whispered, her voice tight. "They made you forget. But I can help you remember." Darius's heart pounded against his chest. The idea that someone had taken his memories, had stolen his very identity, was too much. It had to be a trick, a lie, something the enemy was using against him. And yet, the pain in her voice, the way she looked at him, it felt real, too real. The war that stole him away. His mind was spinning, his body locked in place, trapped between his training and the growing, suffocating doubt. Then movement. Darius's instincts took over. Before he even processed what was happening, his rifle snapped up, his body reacting as it had been trained to for years. A figure emerged from the smoke behind Rhea, a hostile soldier, their weapon raised. Darius fired before thinking. The shot struck true, piercing the soldier's chest. They crumpled to the ground without a sound. Rhea flinched, her gaze flicking toward the fallen enemy. Then, slowly, she turned back to him. "You protected me," she murmured, a mixture of relief and sadness in her tone. Darius stared at the smoking barrel of his rifle. The shot had been automatic, purely driven by instinct. But the realization struck him like a hammer. He had not been protecting himself. He had been protecting her. A choice in the ashes. Rhea's expression softened. "You know me, don't you?" she whispered. Darius didn't answer. Because he didn't know. He didn't know anything anymore. All he knew was that when he had seen her in danger, his body had moved to defend her. Not because of orders. Not because of protocol. But because, somewhere in the depths of his fractured mind, he knew she mattered. He lowered his rifle completely. The moment stretched between them, thick with tension, filled with the weight of everything he had forgotten, everything that had been stolen from him. And then, at last, "What did they do to me?" he asked. Rhea's eyes glistened, but she held his gaze. "They turned you into a weapon," she whispered. Darius clenched his fists. A weapon. That was all he had ever been. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to be. The war was still raging. Soldiers were still fighting. Orders still needed to be followed. But for the first time since the battle had begun, Darius Kane no longer knew which side he was on. And worse, he wasn't sure he cared. Chapter 3. The Weapon Reclaimed. The ruins of the battlefield stretched endlessly before them, a wasteland of shattered metal and broken bodies. Smoke curled into the sky like spectral fingers, the scent of burning fuel and blood thick in the air. Somewhere in the distance, the echoes of war still raged, plasma rounds fired in rapid succession, the distant roar of artillery, the dying screams of soldiers who had fought for causes they barely understood. But here, in this moment, Darius Kane stood motionless. The rifle in his hands felt wrong now, not because of its weight, nor because of its function. He had wielded weapons his entire life. They were as much a part of him as the armor he wore. But now, for the first time, he questioned who he was truly meant to aim at. Rhea stood a few feet away, watching him with those striking golden eyes, the same eyes that had haunted his fragmented thoughts since the moment she spoke his name. Father. Darius exhaled sharply. The words still felt foreign on his tongue. But the more he looked at her, the more he let himself truly see her, the more something deep within him screamed that it was the truth. She wasn't an enemy. She wasn't a soldier from the other side. She was his daughter. And that single realization threatened to break him apart. The ghosts that made him. Rhea's voice was quiet when she spoke. They erased you, she said. Darius felt the words sink into him like a blade to the chest. They took your memories, your identity, everything that made you. You. Rhea clenched her fists. They turned you into their perfect weapon. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that his memories had been lost in battle, that he had always been a soldier, that there was nothing more to him than the orders he followed. But deep down, he knew she was right. The warnings in his neural interface, the flashes of static that tore through his thoughts whenever he tried to remember anything before the war, they weren't malfunctions. They were deliberate. Someone had taken him, reprogrammed him, turned him into something else. Darius swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. Who? His voice came out hoarse, laced with something dark and cold. Who did this to me? Rhea hesitated. Then, finally, she answered. The Dominion. Darius's breath caught. The Dominion. The vast empire that controlled half the galaxy. The force he had served without question. The ones who had given him his orders, sent him into war after war, told him who the enemy was and who deserved to die. He had fought for them, killed for them, died for them, and now he knew the truth. They had stolen him. A mind rebuilt for war. Darius staggered back, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. His neural interface flashed again, but this time, instead of warnings, something new appeared. A voice, crackling through the static. Commander Kane, return to base. The mission is incomplete. The enemy must be eliminated. The words slammed into his mind like a hammer, his body locking up for a fraction of a second. The programming they had burned into him reacted instantly, trying to override his thoughts, trying to force him to obey. He was a soldier. Obedience was all that mattered. You are not authorized to question your directives. Darius gritted his teeth. He could feel it now, the invisible hands wrapped around his mind, the chains forged from commands and control protocols, the suffocating weight of something unnatural clawing at him, trying to pull him back under. Execute the mission. Eliminate the target. That is your only purpose. His vision blurred. His hands trembled. A lifetime of training, of orders drilled into him, of wars fought without hesitation, all came crashing down at once. And yet, through the haze of battle, through the chaos of his fractured mind, one thing cut through the noise. Her voice. Fight it. Darius gasped, his body tensing violently as the Dominion's control pulsed through his nerves like 1,000 volts of electricity. The command burned into him, demanding compliance. But Rhea stepped forward. She reached out not as a soldier, not as an enemy, as his daughter. Please, she whispered, her voice raw. I know you're in there. I know you're more than just their weapon. Darius's hands shook. He could feel the weight of the rifle in his grip, the countless deaths he had delivered with it, the people he had slaughtered without a second thought. He had been a weapon for so long, but was that all he truly was? He looked into Rhea's eyes, and for the first time, he made a choice. His own choice. Darius turned his rifle and fired. The chains are broken. The bullet didn't hit Rhea. It didn't strike an enemy soldier. It ripped through his own neural implant. A deafening pulse of white noise slammed through his skull, his vision exploding with light as the Dominion's command system fractured and died. Darius collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his mind free-falling through a sea of lost memories. And then the dam finally broke. Flashes of a life he had forgotten rushed back into him, images colliding with one another in rapid succession. Holding a newborn baby, her golden eyes staring up at him with innocent wonder. Laughing with a little girl as she sat on his shoulders, gripping his hair and shouting that she wanted to fly. Promising her mother, his wife, now long gone, that he would always protect their child. A world before war. A world before he became this. Darius Kane remembered. And when he lifted his gaze, he was no longer the Dominion soldier. He was Rhea's father. A war worth fighting. The battlefield had changed. Dominion forces were closing in. They knew. They had sensed the break in their control, and they were coming to erase him for good. Rhea grabbed his arm, her face filled with urgency. "We have to go. They'll kill you." Darius looked past her, past the ruins of a battlefield that no longer made sense. The Dominion had stolen everything from him. His past, his mind, his daughter. But they had made one mistake. They hadn't finished the job. Darius tightened his grip on his rifle. "No," he said, his voice strong and sure for the first time in years. Rhea stared at him. "I'm done running," he growled. "We fight." Rhea's breath caught. Then, slowly she smiled. The Dominion had turned him into their greatest weapon. Now, he would use that weapon against them. Chapter 4. The war they never expected. The ground beneath them rumbled as the Dominion forces advanced, their war machines grinding over the rubble of the shattered colony. The air was thick with the scent of scorched metal and smoldering bodies, the aftermath of a battle that had already claimed too many lives. Darius Kane stood tall, his damaged neural implant sparking, his mind finally clear. The fog of obedience, the commands that had dictated his every move gone. For the first time in years, he was truly free. Beside him, Rhea was gripping her rifle, her breathing controlled but her eyes filled with fire. She wasn't afraid, not of him, not of the Dominion. And now, neither was he. Because he wasn't their weapon anymore. He was a father. And he would not let them take his daughter again. The Dominion's arrival. The air hummed with approaching ships, the distant roar of engines signaling the arrival of something far worse than standard infantry. Darius knew what was coming. The Dominion did not tolerate failure. If they were here in force, it meant one thing: they weren't just here to kill him. They were here to erase him. A mechanical voice crackled through his broken neural link, the static-filled command still trying to reassert control. "Commander Kane, stand down. Surrender the asset." Asset. They weren't talking about him. They were talking about Rhea. Darius felt his anger coil deep in his chest, cold and lethal. They had already taken his past. They had forced him to aim his weapon at his own daughter, and now, even with his mind free, they still dared to claim her as theirs. "You belong to us, Kane. Do not resist. You know how this ends." A sharp metallic sound echoed across the ruins as Darius chambered around in his rifle. "Yeah," he muttered. "I do." And then he raised his weapon and fired. The battle for freedom. The first Dominion trooper dropped before their order to fire had even been given. Darius moved before his body even registered the action, his training kicking in, but this time for himself. No orders. No control. Only purpose. Blaster rounds lit up the battlefield, plasma bolts streaking through the air as Dominion forces converged. Darius was already moving, his rifle roaring as he dropped soldier after soldier with precision that only a former elite operative could possess. But this time, he wasn't alone. Rhea was at his side, her movements sharp, controlled, fighting not as a soldier trained by a system, but as someone who had survived it. She was fast, using the wreckage for cover, outmaneuvering Dominion sharpshooters with an ease that made his breath catch. And for the first time, Darius saw her not as the child in his fragmented memories, but as the warrior she had become. She was his daughter, and she was just as dangerous as he was. A reckoning long overdue. The Dominion reinforcements kept coming, but they weren't prepared for this. They had expected obedience. They had expected a broken weapon. What they got was a soldier who had nothing left to lose. Darius moved through them like a storm, his every shot precise, every strike lethal. These were the men who had taken his past, who had turned him into a mindless killer, who had made him aim at his own daughter. And now, he was returning the favor. Bodies hit the ground, armor cracked beneath his fists, rifles were turned against their former owners. Rhea fought beside him, a blur of motion, her golden eyes burning with the fury of someone who had been running for far too long. This wasn't just a battle. This was a reckoning. The Dominion had turned them into survivors. Now, they were turning into something far worse. Enemies. And the Dominion had never known an enemy like them. The final stand. The battlefield fell silent. The last Dominion soldier collapsed, his weapon clattering uselessly against the ruined stone. Smoke curled from the wreckage of their transports, their war machines reduced to scrap metal and ruin. Darius lowered his rifle. His breath was heavy, his body aching from the sheer force of battle, but he didn't falter. He turned to Rhea. She was watching him, her golden eyes reflecting the flickering embers of what they had just done. She stepped closer. For a long moment, she simply looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Darius opened his mouth, but he had no words. Because what was there to say? I'm sorry? It wasn't enough. I should have remembered? That didn't matter now. But then Rhea did something unexpected. She reached out hesitant, unsure, and touched his arm. It was the smallest gesture, but to Darius, it meant everything. She had spent years thinking he was dead, or worse, lost forever. But now, he was here. And even though the war was far from over, they had won this battle together. For the first time, in a very long time, Darius Kane felt human again. A future unwritten. The Dominion was still out there. Their victory today had been a single battle, a warning shot to the empire that had built and broken them. But they would return. Darius knew that. Rhea knew that. And yet as the smoke cleared, as the bodies cooled, as the sky above turned from fire to endless black space, something had changed. They weren't running anymore. They weren't hiding. For the first time, they were choosing to fight. Together, Darius exhaled, looking at his daughter, the woman she had become, the fighter, the survivor. And he smiled. Not much. Just a little. A ghost of something long lost. We should move, he said, his voice rough, but lighter than before. They'll send more. Rhea nodded. Yeah, they always do. She turned toward the wreckage of the Dominion ships, searching for supplies. But before she moved too far, she glanced back at him just once. You okay? She asked softly. Darius blinked at the question. Was he okay? For years, he had been a weapon, a machine, a soldier with no past. Now, he had a daughter, and he had a war to finish. Yeah, he murmured, lifting his rifle one last time. I think I will be.